The gloves landed in Emma Keating's hands before she even understood what was happening. She stared down at them, thick, worn leather, the seams reinforced with crude but careful stitching, the kind of stitching done by a man who'd learned to repair things himself because there was no one else around to do it. They were warm still from his hands. And when she looked up at the man who'd pressed them into her palms, her chest tightened with something she hadn't felt in a very long time, something that terrified her far more than the blizzard swallowing the Wyoming plains whole. "I can't take these," she said, trying to push them back at him. Her own hands were shaking so badly from the cold that the gloves nearly fell into the snow between them. Phineas Holloway didn't step back. He didn't reach out to take them. He just looked at her with those dark, storm-colored eyes gray-green, like the sky above them right now, heavy with unspent snow, and said it in that low, certain voice of his, the kind of voice that didn't require volume to carry weight. "My hands have seen worse cold than this." And that was when Emma's throat closed entirely, because she suddenly understood with absolute clarity that this man, this weathered, solitary, guarded drifter who had never once asked anything of her, was offering her the last layer of protection he owned. His coat was already buttoned to his chin. He had no other gloves. His horse was half a mile back with a cracked shoe. The storm was getting worse by the second. And he was standing there in the open Wyoming wind with his bare hands at his sides like it was the most natural thing in the world, the most natural sacrifice. She looked at his hands then, really looked at them for the first time. They were broad-palmed, scarred across the knuckles, the skin roughened in a way that told stories she'd never been told. Old burns on the right, a scar along the left index finger deep enough to have been something serious. These were hands that had, in fact, seen worse, and they had survived, but it didn't mean they should have to. "Phineas, put them on, Emma." 3 words. That was all it took, not because he said them with authority, though there was that, but because he said her name. Because in 12 days of traveling together across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the American West, he had never once said her name with that kind of quiet urgency, like it mattered. Like she mattered. And Emma Keating, who had not cried since the morning she'd buried her husband 2 years ago in the frozen Kansas earth, felt something crack open behind her sternum. She put the gloves on. She had not always been a woman standing in a Wyoming blizzard, clutching a drifter's last pair of gloves like they were something holy. 3 weeks ago, she had been something else entirely, something that felt now, in retrospect, like a version of herself she barely recognized. She had been desperate, and in 1879, desperate women in the American West made decisions that the comfortable East never had to understand. Her story had started, as so many stories did in that era, with a death and a letter. The death was Thomas Keating's, her husband, gone from a fever in the hard February of 1877, leaving her with a small farm outside of Abilene, Kansas, a mortgage she couldn't sustain alone, and a pride she'd spent 2 years slowly dismantling as circumstances ground her down. Thomas had been a good man. Not a passionate man, not a thrilling man, but solid and dependable, and kind in the way that men who had never had much could still be kind. She'd mourned him genuinely. She had. But grief and starvation were not the same thing, and by the spring of 1879, Emma Keating had come to understand that she could not keep the farm another season. She was 26 years old. She was educated enough to teach school. She was capable and hardworking and, as her neighbor Mrs. Holt had bluntly observed, still handsome enough to make a proper second wife for the right sort of man. Mrs. Holt had meant it practically, not cruelly. That was how things worked. That was how things had to work. The letter had come from a man named Gerald Marsh in Laramie, Wyoming. He'd advertised through a correspondence agency, a respectable one, or so the agency had claimed, seeking a capable woman who could manage a household, assist in bookkeeping, and had no objection to the frontier life. He described himself as a prosperous rancher, 41 years old, steady and sober. He'd enclosed a formal letter of intent and references from a banker in Laramie whose name Emma had verified through the agency. She'd written back. She'd agreed to terms. She'd packed what remained of her life into 2 trunks, sold the farm to a neighboring family, and boarded the Kansas Pacific Railroad west with a ticket she couldn't afford to waste. That was where she had first seen Phineas Holloway. He was sitting in the far end of the passenger car when she boarded in Abilene, and he had not looked up from the battered copy of Emerson's essays he was reading. She'd noticed him the way you notice certain kinds of things, not deliberately, but with that peripheral awareness that something unusual was present. He was tall, even seated. His clothes were clean but old, the kind of clean that came from discipline rather than prosperity. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pushed back from his face, and his face itself was, she had no better word for it even now, weathered. Not old. She'd guessed him at 30 or a hard 28. But weathered like wood that had been through 4 seasons without shelter and had come out the other side still solid, still functional, bearing every mark of what it had endured. He had not spoken to her on the train. He had not tried to engage her in conversation. When she dropped her travel bag in the aisle, he had simply stood, picked it up, set it in the overhead rack, and sat back down without a word or a waiting expression. No expectation of gratitude, just the act. She had thanked him. He had nodded. That was all. She'd arrived in Laramie 2 days later to discover that Gerald Marsh was not 41 years old. He was 58, gray-faced and heavy, with a ranch that was not prosperous but mortgaged, and a reason for wanting a capable woman that had nothing to do with partnership and everything to do with unpaid labor and desperation of his own kind. He had not lied about being sober. She would give him that. But he had lied about nearly everything else, and when Emma had sat across from him in the Laramie Hotel dining room and understood the true shape of what she was being offered, she had felt a cold fury settle into her that had nothing to do with the November wind outside. She had not gone through with it. She knew, even as she made that decision, what it cost her. She had $12.40 left after the train fare and the hotel night. She had 2 trunks and no connections in Laramie. She had no house, no land, no prospects, and winter coming on like a wall. But she was Emma Keating, and she was not going to marry a man who looked at her the way Gerald Marsh had looked at her over that dining table, like she was inventory. She had not known what she was going to do. She had gone back to her hotel room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and thought about it with a precision that required all of her considerable will to maintain. She had skills. She could teach. She could cook. She could keep books. There was a school, she'd seen it, a small clapboard building near the center of town, and if she could speak to someone on the school board before her money ran out entirely, she might find a position. She might find a boarding situation. The knock on her door had come at 7 in the evening, and she had opened it expecting the hotel owner with a question about her trunk. It had been Phineas Holloway. He'd stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and a look of careful, uncomfortable purpose on his face, and he'd said, "I'm sorry to trouble you, ma'am. I overheard, I didn't mean to, but I was at the next table and I know it's not my place. But I'm heading north toward Buffalo in the morning, and I've got an extra horse if you need to get somewhere." Emma had stared at him. "Why would you do that?" she had asked. It had come out more bluntly than she'd intended, but she was past the point of soft phrasing. "You don't know me." He had looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and something complicated had moved through them, not quite discomfort, not quite resignation, more like a man deciding whether a certain truth was worth speaking. "Because you looked like you were making a calculation," he'd said, "and not one you wanted to make." She had let him in, not literally. She had spoken to him in the doorway like a sensible woman who did not invite strange men into her room, and they had talked for 20 minutes on the threshold of that hotel room while the Wyoming wind rattled the window at the end of the hall. His name was Phineas Holloway. He was 31 years old. He was not from any one place in particular. He had grown up in Missouri, worked cattle drives from Texas north through Kansas, spent 3 years in Colorado in the silver mines, lost a partner to a cave-in, and had been drifting west and north ever since in the way that men do when they are looking for something they can't name but can't stop moving without. He was heading to Buffalo, Wyoming, where he had heard there was work at a large cattle operation. He had 2 horses. He knew the road. He had not, he'd told her with an absolute absence of pretension, any designs on her. He was making the offer because she was clearly in trouble, and he was clearly able to help, and there was no particular moral credit in being capable and choosing not to use it. Emma had said she would think about it. She had thought about it for 1 full hour, lying on that narrow hotel bed staring at the ceiling, and had concluded that the risk of accepting a stranger's help was meaningfully smaller than the risk of staying in Laramie with $12 and counting while winter came in. She had found him at breakfast and said yes. That was how it began, practically, necessarily, without any particular warmth between them. Emma had been wary. She had been burned once already in this journey, and she was not in the habit of extending trust quickly to anyone, let alone a man she'd met on a train. But trust, she was discovering, could be built in unusual ways. It was built, first, in small demonstrations. Phineas never once made her feel that she owed him anything for his help. He treated her as a capable adult at every turn, not with the chivalric condescension of a man performing gallantry, but with the simple respect of someone who assumed competence until shown otherwise. When she'd said she could handle the horse herself, he had not hovered or second-guessed. He had shown her the animal's particular habits once, and then let her manage the relationship herself. The horse was a chestnut mare named Cassidy that Phineas had acquired in Colorado, and that was, in his words, particular about mornings but reasonable after 10 o'clock. This proved accurate. Emma developed an affection for Cassidy that she recognized was partly transferred feeling, partly genuine. They rode north through the early days of November in weather that was cold but clear, following the road toward Casper, and then northeast toward Buffalo. They talked sometimes and were silent more often, and the silences were never uncomfortable, a thing Emma found quietly remarkable, because she could count on one hand the people in her life she'd ever been able to be quiet with. She learned him in pieces, the way you learn the landscape from a moving horse gradually, with the understanding that what you're seeing is only ever a portion of the whole. He had been a cowhand for most of his adult life. He had done the Kishom Trail 3 times before he was 25. He had been, he acknowledged with the brevity of a man who had made peace with something difficult, engaged once to a woman in Wichita, a schoolteacher who died of typhoid the year before their planned wedding. He said this without drama, factually, the way you state a fact that has been processed into something quiet and settled, and Emma had said, "I'm sorry," and he had said, "Thank you," and they had moved on. She had told him about Thomas. He had listened in the same way, attentive, non-pitying, present without pressing. She had told him about Gerald Marsh, the full truth of it, in a moment of surprising candor on the 3rd evening when they'd made camp off the road and the fire was burning well and she'd had enough of that particular wait. She told him about the letter, the agency, the train ticket she couldn't waste, the dining room, the realization. She told it plainly, without self-pity, but she watched his face while she did. Something had moved through his expression that she could only describe as anger, not at her, very clearly not at her, but on her behalf, a quiet, controlled fury at the particular cruelty of a man exploiting a system designed to take advantage of women in exactly Emma's position. "Men like that," he said, and then stopped, started again. "I'm sorry that happened to you." "I'm not," she said, surprising herself. "Or I am, but I'm also not, because if it hadn't, I wouldn't be here." She hadn't meant it the way it sounded. But the way Phineas had looked at her in that firelight, briefly and then away, told her he'd heard something in it that had not been entirely unintentional. That was the moment things shifted, though she would not have admitted it for several more days. She began to notice him in ways that were not purely pragmatic. The way he handled his horse with a patience and ease that was almost tender. The way he watched the horizon, always, not with paranoia, but with a kind of deep attentiveness that spoke of someone who had learned the cost of inattention. The way he laughed, which he did rarely but completely, a real laugh, starting from somewhere genuine and involving his whole face in a way that transformed it. The way he cooked, badly. She had taken over camp cooking by the 5th day not because he'd asked, but because watching him attempt to produce anything edible from their trail provisions was genuinely painful. He had accepted this transfer of duty with something she could only describe as relief, and had thereafter done all the setting up of camp and tending of horses with such consistent thoroughness that it became a kind of wordless negotiation, each of them taking on what they did well, asking nothing specific, building something functional and surprisingly comfortable. She had begun to fall for him on the 7th day. She had not acknowledged it to herself until the 9th, because she was a careful woman, and because the timing was objectively terrible, and because she had absolutely no idea what Phineas Holloway felt about her and was not going to make assumptions. The 9th day was when he told her about the cold. They'd been riding through a narrow draw, the wind picking up from the north in a way that had the horses nervous, and Emma had made a quiet remark about her hands being numb. She'd said it practically, not complaining, just noting the fact to explain why she needed to stop briefly and warm them. He had looked at her hands and then looked at the sky and then said, "We need to push for that ranch we saw the marker for should be 6 miles north. This is getting worse." Then, as they'd urged the horses to a faster pace, he had said in a different tone, quiet and almost to himself, "I spent a winter in the Sangre de Cristos once with nothing but a thin coat and one blanket, lost feeling in 3 fingers for 2 weeks." She had looked at him. And it came back, he said. Eventually. "What were you doing up there?" He was quiet for a moment. "Running," he said, "from something I couldn't actually outrun, so it wasn't a particularly efficient use of winter." She had understood, because she was a woman who knew what it was to do something that didn't work and keep doing it anyway because moving was better than stopping. "And did you eventually stop running?" He looked at her then, with those gray-green eyes that always seemed to be processing something just behind the words. "I stopped that particular run," he said. "Buffalo's maybe the first place I've headed toward something rather than away from it." She had not asked what that something was. She was afraid the answer might be the job. She was afraid it might be more than that. She was afraid of both possibilities equally. On the 10th day, his horse threw a shoe on a rocky stretch of road, and the shoe bent badly enough that they could not simply nail it back. They were 3 miles from the nearest settlement, which turned out to be a trading post and small relay station called Holden's, crossing 2 buildings and a corral, operated by a taciturn man named Silas Holden and his grown daughter, Ruth. Silas could reshoe the horse, but not until morning. The light was failing and he didn't trust the job in lamplight. That meant spending the night. Ruth Holden was 20 and sharp-eyed, and had apparently seen every variety of human arrangement pass through her father's relay station. She had given Emma and Phineas one measuring look, concluded something, and assigned them the 2 pallets in the relay room with the businesslike absence of ceremony that made it clear she either didn't care or had already made her assumptions. Emma and Phineas had arranged themselves with the same careful, almost formal distance they maintained in camp, which was to say, far enough apart for every propriety, but close enough that she was aware of every slight shift of his breathing in the dark room. She had lain awake thinking about the fact that she was traveling across Wyoming with a man she had known for 10 days, that she had no plan beyond Buffalo, that she was no longer entirely sure Buffalo was the right destination at all, and that the primary reason her certainty about Buffalo had eroded was sleeping 6 feet away from her. She had thought about that for a long time in the dark. In the morning, while Silas was reshoeing the horse, and Ruth was offering coffee with the same brisk efficiency she brought to everything, Phineas had come to stand beside Emma at the relay station's single window, and they had watched the northern sky together in silence. "That's a serious sky," Emma had said. "Yes. How far to Buffalo from here?" 2 days in good weather." He paused. Less good if that front moves in the way it looks like it wants to. She had turned to look at him and found that he was already looking at her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the silence was full of something that had been accumulating for 10 days of campfires and trail miles and quiet conversations and small, unasked-for kindnesses. "I'm going to say something," Phineas said, and he said it like a man who had decided with difficulty to stop being cautious about a particular thing. Emma waited. "I know this is—" He stopped, tried again. "I know you've been through a series of circumstances that have given you more than enough reason to be wary of people's intentions, especially men who are offering things." He was looking at the sky, not at her. "I want to say, for clarity's sake, that I'm aware of that. And I want to say that whatever I've offered the horse, the road, He made a small gesture that encompassed, she thought, the past 10 days in total. "There are no conditions attached to it. I need you to know that." "I know that," she said quietly. He looked at her then. "I also want to say another stop." He was not usually a man who stopped and started, and it moved her, watching him search for the words. "I like talking to you. I like riding with you. I like—" A brief, almost pained expression crossed his face. "You, Emma, in a way that I wasn't expecting and that I don't have any right to act on, given that you're in a complicated situation and I'm this." He made a rueful gesture at himself. "But I wanted to say it, so it was said." Emma had looked at him for a very long time. "Phineas Holloway," she had said eventually. "Ma'am. I have been awake since 2 in the morning having approximately the same conversation with myself." He stared at her. "With the difference," she added, "that I concluded I do have the right to act on it if I want to, and that the complication of my situation is my business to navigate and not yours to worry about on my behalf." Something happened in his face that she could only describe as the slow release of a long-held tension, something that had been wound tight in him, not just for the past 10 days but for much longer, coming carefully undone. "Is that so?" he said. "That is so." Ruth Holden, who had been clearly listening from 6 feet away with absolutely no attempt at subtlety, had said, "The coffee is getting cold," and handed them each a cup with an expression of supreme satisfaction. And both Emma and Phineas had laughed, that real, sudden, complete kind of laughter that comes when the pressure of something serious releases all at once. And that had been, in its own way, a kind of sealing. They had ridden out of Holden's Crossing on the 11th day with the horse reshod and the sky looking worse, and things between them had changed in the way that things change when the unspoken becomes spoken, slowly at first, carefully, like weight being redistributed, and then with increasing ease as the new arrangement settled into place. He had taken her hand that evening, helping her down from Cassidy after a long ride, and held it a beat longer than necessary. She had let him. They had looked at each other in the fading light, and it had been, in its simplicity, one of the most charged moments Emma had ever experienced. On the 12th day, the front that Phineas had watched with such careful attention from the window of Holden's Crossing arrived in force. It came from the northwest in the late afternoon, moving faster than expected, the sky turning that particular shade of gray-white that meant serious snow and wind combined. They had been 3 hours from Buffalo when the first real gusts hit. Phineas had tried to urge the horses faster, but his horse, reshod and handling well, had started favoring the new shoe almost immediately, a subtle wrongness in the gait that required them to slow, and within an hour they were still 2 miles from Buffalo with a full blizzard building around them and the temperature dropping at a rate that was alarming. That was when his horse had gone fully lame. The shoe had cracked a bad job, Phineas said quietly, not with anger, just with the assessment of a man cataloging a problem, and the horse could not go further without risking real injury. He had dismounted immediately, and that had left them with 1 horse, 2 people, and 2 miles to go in a blizzard. Emma could have ridden ahead on Cassidy. That was the logical solution. She had offered it. Phineas had said no. Not in a high-handed way, he had said it because Cassidy had not been ridden hard in a storm of this kind, and in his experienced judgment the mare was not completely reliable in these exact conditions, and he would not put Emma on a nervous horse alone in a blizzard. He would walk his horse and walk alongside her on Cassidy, and they would make those 2 miles together. And it would not be the worst 2 miles he'd ever walked. Emma had not argued, because she understood that this was not stubborn chivalry. He genuinely knew horses, and his reading of Cassidy in that moment had the quality of real assessment, not performance. They had gone slowly. The wind was brutal. Emma's hands, which she'd had tucked inside her coat, were losing feeling faster than she'd anticipated. Her gloves were thin, Eastern things, bought in Abilene for Kansas winters that were nothing like this. That was when Phineas had stopped walking. She'd looked back at him and found him watching her hands with an expression of focused concern, and before she understood what was happening, he had pulled off his own gloves, thick, real leather ones, made for this kind of work, made for this kind of cold, and pressed them into her hands. "I can't take these," she said. He looked at her with those eyes. "My hands have seen worse cold than this." And she had understood, fully and without the ability to deny it, that she was in love with this man. Not in the tentative, hedging way of the past few days, not as an intellectual acknowledgement, fully and completely and with no remaining uncertainty. She put the gloves on. They made Buffalo in an hour and a half. Buffalo, Wyoming in November of 1879, was a town that had the energetic, unfinished quality of the frontier, a main street of wooden storefronts, a hotel, 2 saloons, a church under construction, a school that appeared to be in active use. The cattle industry had brought money and people, and the town was in that particular phase of development that was simultaneously promising and precarious. Phineas brought them to the largest of the 2 hotels, a 2-story building called the Frontier House, and Emma was inside with dry boots and a room key before she had entirely processed the transition from the outdoors to the warmth. The woman at the front desk, a stout, capable woman in her 50s named Mrs. Aldrich, had taken one look at them and produced hot coffee without being asked, and Emma had drunk it standing at the desk and thought that she had never tasted anything as purely good as that coffee. Phineas had seen to the horses first. He always saw to the horses first. When he came in from the stable 20 minutes later, his face was red from the cold and his hands. She could see it now, could see the aftermath of 2 miles barehanded in a Wyoming blizzard, were shaking slightly, though he held them still with the control of a man who was determined not to make a fuss. Emma had crossed the lobby toward him with the look she suspected was on her face fully visible, and she had taken his hands in both of hers, her hands in his gloves and his hands in hers, and held them and looked at him. "You said your hands had seen worse," she said. "They have," he said. There was a slight hitch in his voice that might have been cold or might have been something else. "They're shaking. Temporarily. Phineas," he looked at her. All the careful, habitual containment of this man, the self-sufficiency, the habit of needing nothing and asking for nothing, the fortress of competence behind which something much more vulnerable had been living for a very long time, all of it was visible to her in that moment. Visible and understood. "Thank you," she said, meaning all of it. The gloves, the road, the horse, the 10 days, the standing in the cold without complaint and without demand. He said very quietly, "Thank you for putting them on." She was not entirely sure he meant just the gloves, and she was entirely certain she did not mean just the gloves, and Mrs. Aldrich behind the front desk was demonstrating the same quality of apparent obliviousness that Ruth Holden had demonstrated, which meant she was probably listening to every word. They sat together in the hotel dining room that night, dried out and warm, and ate the best meal either of them had had in weeks. A real meal, hot and plentiful, and talked for 2 hours with the ease of people who had gotten past the careful stage and were now in the more interesting territory of actual acquaintance. They talked about books. He had read more than she'd expected, broadly and seriously, that battered Emerson being one of several. They talked about what they believed, about what they wanted, about Buffalo, and whether it would provide what they were each looking for. The cattle operation he'd heard of turned out to be the Clearwater Ranch, owned by a man named Donald Haskell, reputed to be one of the more solid operations in the county. Phineas intended to present himself for work there in the morning. Emma intended to present herself to the school board. She had learned from Mrs. Aldrich, who proved to be an excellent source of local information, that the school's current teacher had left abruptly 3 weeks prior due to a family emergency and had not returned, leaving the school in a state of anxious suspension while the board figured out what to do. "You're credentialed?" Mrs. Aldrich had asked. Emma had her certificate with her. She had packed it specifically, almost instinctively, because credentials were proof of something that could not be taken away. "I'll tell Mr. Caldwell you'll come by in the morning," Mrs. Aldrich said, with the decisive efficiency of a woman who ran a small-town hotel and therefore knew everything and everyone. "He's on the school board and he's desperate enough to interview a traveling stranger, which tells you how much he needs someone." So they both had their morning purposes, and they sat in that dining room and built the next part of the story together across a table scattered with coffee cups and the remains of a good meal, and Emma thought, "This is what I wanted, not the arrangement with Gerald Marsh, not any arrangement at all. This actual conversation, this actual person, this feeling of being genuinely seen and genuinely interested in return. This." She did not say all of that. Some of it she let exist in the space between words, which was its own kind of communication. When they said goodnight in the hotel hallway, they stood for a moment in the way of people who have arrived at a moment where more than good night is possible, but where the exact shape of more has not yet been determined. He had brushed his knuckles against her cheek, just that, light and brief and deliberate, and said, "I'm glad you were on that train." "I'm glad you weren't minding your business," she said. He had smiled. It was the full smile, the real one, the one that transformed his face, and Emma had taken that smile to bed with her and thought about it until she slept. In the morning, they went their separate ways for the first time since Laramie, and Emma walked into the meeting with Mr. Caldwell of the Buffalo School Board with the gloves still on her hands, because she had not given them back yet, and he had not asked. Mr. Caldwell was a small, earnest man who taught at the Sunday school and served on 3 boards simultaneously, and who interrogated Emma's teaching certificate and her previous experience with the focused intensity of a man who was desperate but still careful. She answered everything directly and honestly. She had taught for 1 year in an Abilene schoolroom before Thomas's death had required her full attention. She had a genuine gift for mathematics and was adequate in all the rest. "The school here runs 42 students," Caldwell told her, "ages from 6 to 15, 1 room, hard winters." "I've had a useful introduction to Wyoming winters recently," Emma said. He had hired her on a trial basis through the end of the school year, with salary paid in advance for the first month against her boarding costs, which meant that Emma Keating had employment, income, and a room at a boarding house on the north end of Main Street before noon on her first day in Buffalo. Phineas, she learned when they met for dinner, had been hired by Donald Haskell at the Clearwater Ranch. "He seemed like a fair man," Phineas said, "demanding but fair." "When do you start?" "Tomorrow. They'll want me out at the ranch by first light." He looked at his coffee. "It's 6 miles out." Emma understood what this meant. The easy proximity of the road and the hotel and the same dining table was ending. He would be at the ranch during the week, back in town on weekends perhaps. It was the practical reality of their situations. "That's all right," she said, meaning it, though it required a small interior adjustment. He looked at her. "I'd like to keep," he paused, searching for the word. "I'd like this not to stop." "This," she said, "you and I talking." "You and I," he made a gesture that encompassed, as before, rather a lot. "I know we've arrived somewhere and our lives here are going to be practical and separate, and I am not assuming—" "Phineas," she said. He stopped. "I would like that too." He exhaled slowly. "Right," he said. "Good." She returned his gloves to him across the dinner table. She had brought them down specifically, washed and dried and buffed clean where the trail had marked them. He took them and looked at them, and then looked at her with an expression she was beginning to read accurately, which meant she was getting to know him, which meant something was happening that was real and not imagined. "I need to buy my own pair," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and then added, so quietly she almost missed it, "though I don't mind the alternative." She had not slept well that night, but not unhappily. The weeks that followed had the quality of building of two separate lives being constructed in parallel and with increasing deliberateness toward each other. Emma's school was everything Caldwell had described and more. 42 students ranging from a gap-toothed 6-year-old named Petey Marsh, no relation to Gerald, she'd confirmed, to a 15-year-old girl named Clara who was sharp enough that Emma found herself genuinely challenged to provide sufficient material. The room was cold in the mornings until the stove got going. The older boys were occasionally difficult in the way of boys who had been doing men's work since they were 12 and found school an imposition. Emma handled them with a directness that was, she discovered, more effective than any softness would have been in that context. She found Buffalo to be a community with the qualities common to frontier towns: practicality, mutual aid, a tolerance for variety that the more established East couldn't quite manage, alongside the rougher edges that came with that same frontier character. She was welcomed mostly as a practical necessity and evaluated on her performance, which suited her entirely. On Saturdays, Phineas came to town. He came every Saturday without exception through November and into December, riding the 6 miles from Clearwater Ranch in whatever weather the Wyoming winter had chosen to produce, and they had developed a Saturday routine with the organic ease of people who liked each other and liked the shape of their time together. In the morning, he ran whatever errands the ranch needed in town: supplies, mail, occasional business with the feed merchant. Emma finished her week's preparation for the following school week. They met at noon at the Frontier House dining room, which had become their table in the same way that certain tables in certain places become yours through repetition. In the afternoon, they walked when the weather allowed. Buffalo had a clean, bracing winter quality on clear days that Emma had come to genuinely appreciate, or stayed in the hotel's small sitting room when it didn't, playing chess on the board that lived on the corner table, reading side by side, talking about everything that had accumulated over the week. She had met Donald Haskell once, when he'd come into town for business and stopped into the Frontier House. He was a broad, steady man in his late 40s, sunburned even in winter, with an evaluating gaze and a courtesy that was genuine rather than performed. He had looked at Emma and then at Phineas in the way of a man taking stock, and had said, "So you're the teacher. Phineas speaks well of you." And then he had ordered coffee and they had talked about the school's funding situation, which was a concern to him as a father of 2 students in Emma's class, and she had liked him. "He speaks well of you too," Emma had told Phineas afterward. "He's a good man to work for," Phineas said, "fair in a way that's actually real. High praise from you," a slight smile. "I don't give it otherwise." She had known by this point that she was in love with him entirely, and she believed, with the careful certainty of a woman who watched people closely and was not given to wishful thinking, that he felt the same. The evidence was in 100 small things: the way he listened to her, not with the surface attention of a man waiting to speak, but with genuine absorption. The way he brought her things she'd mentioned wanting a new book. A particular kind of ink she'd noted was better for the school ledger, without announcement or expectation of comment. The way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression that was so nakedly, almost painfully tender that it made her breath catch. But he was a careful man, a man who had lost someone he loved to death, who had spent years in a state of productive rootlessness that was also, she suspected, a form of self-protection. He was not going to hurry. He was not going to press. She had decided, by the 3rd Saturday in December, that this was admirable and she respected it, and it was also entirely possible that, left to his own pace, Phineas Holloway would take approximately forever, and she was 36 years old. No, 26, she corrected herself, though 36 felt more accurate given the last 2 years, and she did not want to spend forever being cautious about something that was already decided. On that Saturday, after their noon meal, she had said, "I need to tell you something." He had put down his coffee cup with the attentiveness of a man who understood that tone. "I am not in an uncomplicated position," she said. "I know that. I know you know that. I know that you're being careful, and I know why, and I respect it." She met his eyes directly, the way she met everything directly. "But I want to say clearly that the complication of my situation is resolved. I am here. I have a job, I have income, I have a future in this town that I've built myself in 6 weeks and that I'm building more of every day. I don't need anything from you." She paused. "Except what I actually want, which is you. Not as a rescuer and not as a practical arrangement and not as a careful, appropriate, arm's length whatever this is." She made a gesture. "I want you, Phineas. I want this to be a real thing. If that's what you want too." The silence was about 4 seconds long and felt like 4 years. Then Phineas had said, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, "Emma Keating, I have wanted that since approximately the third day on the road when you told me exactly what you thought of Gerald Marsh's arrangement, and I realized I had never met anyone quite like you in my life." "Then why?" "Because I had nothing to offer you," he said. "I had 2 horses and no fixed position and a history of moving on. You had just escaped one bad arrangement. I wasn't going to be another man presenting you with conditions." She looked at him. "You don't have conditions." "No." "Then what you have is a job and a salary and a demonstrated character over 12 days of close proximity, which is more than most people get." He considered this. "Also," she said, "I was the one who chose to come on this road. You offered, I decided. You're not responsible for my circumstances." "I know that intellectually," he said. "Start knowing it the other way too." He had reached across the table then and taken her hand, properly this time, deliberately and without any pretense of it being accidental. Her hand in his, her fingers lacing between his scarred, broad-palmed ones, and they had sat like that for a long moment in the hotel dining room with Mrs. Aldrich demonstrably not looking at them from the other side of the room. "I would very much like to court you properly," Phineas said. Yes," Emma said. "That is." Christmas in Buffalo that year was a community affair. The church had been finished enough to hold a service, and Mrs. Aldrich organized a dinner at the frontier house that drew most of the town's population in for the evening. Emma had helped with the decoration and the organization in the weeks leading up to it, her teaching schedule giving her a natural place in the community's life. And she arrived on Christmas evening to a room full of people she now knew by name. Phineas had ridden in from Clearwater in the afternoon, and she had seen him from across the dining room as she was helping to arrange plates, and the particular quality of seeing him, the lift in her chest, the small involuntary smile, the way everything in the room briefly receded, was something she had stopped being surprised by. It was simply true now, part of the furniture of her interior life. He had crossed the room to her, and they had stood together in the way of people who have established their arrangement, which meant that the town of Buffalo was aware by this point. Mrs. Aldrich alone had probably seen to that the new teacher and the hand at Clearwater were a pair. There had been no controversy about this. Buffalo was a practical community. Donald Haskell had come in with his wife, Martha, and their 2 children, including Clara, Emma's sharpest student. And it was through this connection that Emma met Martha Haskell, who was a woman of considerable intelligence and capability who had built a life at Clearwater Ranch with the same determined practicality that Emma recognized in herself, and who became, over the next few months, a genuine friend. "He's a good man," Martha told Emma at one point in January, speaking of Phineas in the direct way of someone offering relevant information. "Donald says he's the best cowhand he's had in years. Steady. Takes care of things, takes care of the men around him." "I know," Emma said, with a warmth she didn't try to conceal. Martha had looked at her with the satisfied expression of a woman who approved of what she was seeing. "Good," she said simply. The winter deepened. Emma taught 5 days a week and built her school into something she was proud of, added a reading program for the older students, convinced the school board to invest in 2 new mathematics texts, and began to know every one of her 42 students well enough to teach to each of them specifically. This was the work she was good at, the work that felt like the fullest use of what she was, and she did it with an energy that surprised even herself given how depleted the previous 2 years had left her. Phineas came to town every Saturday, and they added Sundays when the ranch work allowed riding together in the clear winter afternoons, attending the church service together, spending the long Sunday evenings in conversation that ranged over everything from books to politics to the particular question of what America was doing with its West, a subject on which both of them had complex opinions. It was in one of these conversations that Emma learned more about the dark past that had been moving behind everything Phineas had said and done since she'd met him. They had been talking about the Kishom Trail. She'd asked about it, curious about his years doing that work, and he had described it with the vividness of someone who had been very young during the experience and had been shaped by it in ways that couldn't be fully explained. The violence of it, not just the physical danger but the cultural violence of the cattle era, the displacement, the hard men and harder circumstances, had been a formative experience. And then, carefully, he had told her about Missouri. He had grown up poor in Missouri, one of 5 children, his father dead when Phineas was 11. He had gone to work at 14 because the family needed the money, and by 16 he was doing cattle work because it paid better than farm work and he was good at it. By 18 he was on the trail. He told her about a man named Cutter, a foreman he'd worked under during his second trail run, a man who ran his crews with a brutality that was systemic and covered by the economics of the drive. Phineas had been 20. He had witnessed things during that drive that he described with a careful, specific precision that told Emma he had never fully left them. He had tried to intervene in a particular incident. He didn't say what exactly, and Cutter had turned that intervention into a punishment that left Phineas with the scar on his left hand and a week unable to work without agony, and the understanding that the economic structure in which he was working protected Cutter and had no interest in protecting him. He had finished that drive. He had been paid. He had left and never worked for Cutter again. "But you kept doing trail work," Emma said. "Most outfits weren't Cutter," he said. "I learned to read them before signing on, and I wasn't going to be driven out of work I was good at by one bad man." That required considerable. She searched for the word determination. "Stubbornness," he said. "It's a different thing." She had reached up and touched the scar on his left hand. Then they were sitting close on the bench outside the hotel on a cold but clear January afternoon and traced it lightly with her thumb. "Both," she said. "Stubbornness requires determination." He had turned his hand under hers and held it, and they had sat like that for a long time looking at the main street of Buffalo moving past in its ordinary, energetic way, and Emma had thought, "I want this for the rest of my life. This exact thing. This person, this quietness, this honesty." February brought a second hard storm. Nothing like the November blizzard, but significant enough that Phineas was unable to get to town for 2 Saturdays running. Emma had discovered, in his absence, the exact dimensions of how much she depended on those Saturdays, not for practical purposes, but for the quality of herself they produced, the way being with him made her more fully herself rather than less. She wrote him letters during those 2 weeks, sending them out to Clearwater Ranch with the feed delivery. He wrote back 2 letters, densely covered with his careful, precise handwriting, talking about the ranch and the storms and what he was reading and what he was thinking, and reading those letters was almost as good as sitting across from him. Almost. When he came back into town on the 3rd Saturday, they had stood in the lobby of the Frontier House for a full minute just looking at each other, and then he had kissed her for the first time properly, with both his hands cupping her face, and Emma had understood with complete clarity that she had never been kissed quite like that before with that quality of attention, that gentleness that was also absolutely certain of itself. "Mrs. Aldrich had said from behind the desk, "It's about time," and they had both laughed, and the laugh had broken against the kiss and continued, and it was one of the best moments Emma Keating had ever experienced in her life. Spring came to Buffalo slowly, then all at once. By April, the snow was retreating from the lower elevations, and the whole territory had the particular urgency of a landscape shaking off something difficult and reasserting itself. The school year was winding toward its end, and Emma was already in conversation with the board about the following year. She intended to stay. There was no ambiguity in this. She had made a life here, a real one, and she was not going to abandon it. Phineas had been at Clearwater for 5 months and had, as Donald Haskell told Emma with the quiet satisfaction of a good employer recognizing good work, proven himself as valuable as any man on the operation. Donald had offered him a more permanent position, not just seasonal handwork, but a position of genuine responsibility, managing the northern section of the ranch's grazing operation. Phineas had told Emma about this offer on a Sunday afternoon in March on one of their rides, and had said it with the slightly stunned quality of a man who has not entirely believed, until recently, that his life was supposed to be something that built toward something. "Are you going to take it?" she had asked. "I want to," he said, "but I want to talk to you about it first." She looked at him. "Why?" He looked at her steadily. "Because it matters to me what it means for." He stopped. Started more carefully. "Emma, I have been trying very hard not to get ahead of things, not to assume, not to." He stopped again. "I want to ask you something," he said. "I need you to know before I ask it that the answer has no bearing on whether I—" "Phineas," she said. He stopped. "Ask," she said. He took a breath. He was not a man who was usually nervous. The nervousness was one of the most touching things she'd ever seen. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because of circumstance or convenience or any practical consideration. Because I love you, because I have loved you since." He made a short, honest gesture. "Since somewhere in Wyoming in a blizzard, I think. Or possibly earlier than that. Will you?" Emma had already known what her answer was. She had known it for weeks, had been waiting with a patient certainty for this moment, had known it was coming with the same precision with which she could feel a change in weather. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely and without reservation, yes." He had kissed her there on the trail, with the spring Wyoming landscape all around them, with Cassidy standing patiently a few feet away, and it had been more than a kiss. It had been a kind of completion, a closing of the distance that had been progressively narrowing since November. They were married in June of 1880, in the finished church in Buffalo, with Donald and Martha Haskell as witnesses and Mrs. Aldrich weeping openly and unashamedly in the front pew, and 42 school children scattered throughout the congregation with varying degrees of solemnity. Ruth Holden and her father had made the journey from Holden's Crossing when they'd received the invitation. Emma had insisted on inviting them, because it seemed right to acknowledge the place where something had begun to become possible. Silas Holden had pumped Phineas's hand at the reception with the vigor of a man who approved of outcomes, and Ruth had hugged Emma with the warmth of a young woman who had been rooting for them since that morning in the relay station when she'd handed over coffee and maintained her conspicuous oblivion. "I knew," Ruth told Emma, "from the way he looked at you when he thought you weren't watching. I knew." Emma had smiled and said, "So did I just needed him to figure it out." They had moved into a small house on the east edge of Buffalo that Phineas had spent the spring preparing, a solid house, nothing grand, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a real stove, with a proper stable for the horses and enough garden space that Emma had immediately begun planning what she would grow. It was the first home she'd had since the Kansas farm, and it was, in every way that mattered, different. The farm had been survival. This was living. Phineas took the permanent position at Clearwater and rode out every morning before light, and came home in the evening smelling of horses and cold air, and the particular outdoor quality that Emma had come to associate with safety in a way she hadn't expected. He read in the evenings, and she wrote her school preparation or read alongside him, and they talked, and they were quiet, and they wwere together. They had their first argument in July, a real one. Not a disagreement, but a genuine collision of two strong-willed people processing different things with different assumptions. It was about money. Phineas had a habit of extreme self-sufficiency that sometimes expressed itself as a reluctance to spend on himself, which Emma found both understandable given his history and occasionally maddening given that they were now, explicitly and formally, a partnership. She had said this directly. He had initially defended himself in the way of someone who had not quite internalized the partnership as fully as he thought. They had been sharp with each other for about 20 minutes, and then Phineas had stopped in the middle of a sentence and looked at her with an expression of genuine self-recognition and said, "You're right. I'm arguing a position I don't actually believe because it's a habit," which was not the kind of thing that most men Emma had known would say in the middle of an argument. She had loved him even more for it. They had resolved it, and they had laughed about it afterward in the specific way that couples laugh about the first real fight, with the relief of people who have learned that they can disagree and repair and come through intact. By fall, Emma was back to teaching her second school year, and Phineas had settled fully into his position at Clearwater, with the quiet authority of a man who knew his work well and did it honestly. Donald Haskell had given him increased responsibilities, and Phineas handled them with the same steady competence he brought to everything. In October, Emma discovered she was pregnant. She told Phineas on a Sunday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up and the autumn dark outside and the stove warm at her back. She told him directly, because she was Emma and she did not build to things unnecessarily. He had stared at her for a moment with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, a kind of struck stillness, as if something profound had just rearranged itself somewhere inside him. And then he had stood up from his chair and come around the table and knelt beside her chair. She would remember this detail always, the kneeling, the directness of it, and taken her hands in both of his and held them against his chest and been silent for a long moment. "Are you?" he started. "I'm well," she said, because she knew what he was asking. "I feel fine. I've felt fine." He nodded. His hands were very still around hers. He stopped, started again. "I don't have a word for what I am right now." "Phineas Holloway at a loss for words," she said softly. "That's a thing." He had laughed, and the laugh was the full real one, and she had put her arms around him there on the kitchen floor, and they had stayed like that for a long time while the stove ticked warmly, and the Wyoming autumn held itself outside. Their son was born in the early summer of 1881, delivered by Dr. Clarence Webb, who had established a practice in Buffalo the previous year, and was considered by the community as an unexpected luxury. The labor was hard but not dangerous, and Emma came through it with the fierce competence she brought to all difficult things, and Phineas sat in the outer room for the hours it took with a stillness that Ruth Holden, who had come to Buffalo to visit and had stayed for the birth, later described as the most terrified quiet I have ever seen on a human being. When the doctor came out and told him he had a son and that Emma was well, Ruth had watched Phineas Holloway close his eyes for a full 15 seconds and breathe, and had decided that this was among the most moving things she had ever witnessed. They named him James Thomas Holloway, James for Phineas's father, Thomas for Emma's first husband, because she had loved Thomas genuinely and he had been good to her, and a name was a small and honest honor. James was, from the first, an energetic and demanding small person with his father's eyes and his mother's directness, and he upended the orderly rhythm of the house in Holloway fashion, which was to say, with complete thoroughness and no apology. Phineas with James was something Emma watched with a quiet, full happiness that was different from any other happiness she had known. He was patient in the way he was patient with horses, attentive, unhurried, taking each development seriously. He carried James on early morning walks before Emma was awake, the baby bundled against the cold, and Emma would watch them through the window sometimes. This man who had spent years moving and not belonging anywhere, standing still in the early light of a Wyoming morning with his son, and feel that the world had arranged itself into something genuinely right. Clara Haskell graduated from Emma's school that June, the first full graduation ceremony Buffalo's school had held, an event that Emma had organized with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and which was attended by what seemed like the entire county. Clara was going east for further schooling, to a women's academy in Illinois that Emma had helped her identify and apply to, and the pride Emma felt watching her cross the room to receive her certificate was complicated and clean. After the ceremony, Phineas had found Emma standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching Clara talk to her parents with bright, excited eyes, and he had come to stand beside her and taken her hand in the easy way they had now, their hands finding each other without ceremony. "She's going to change the world," Emma said. "She's going to try," Phineas agreed. "And knowing Clara, she'll mostly succeed." Emma turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, that particular look, the one she'd been seeing for nearly 2 years now, and that still, produced a warmth in her chest that was uncomplicated and total. "I'm happy," she said. It came out slightly surprised, the way true things sometimes do. "Good," he said, softly and with complete seriousness. "So am I." In the autumn of 1882, they learned that Emma was pregnant again. James was 15 months old and had recently discovered the full range of mobility available to a child of his age and temperament, which meant that the house was a more chaotic place than it had been. Phineas had adapted to this with the same steady flexibility he adapted to everything. He had built a small gate across the kitchen doorway, a small fence around the garden that James was inclined to investigate and disassemble, and had a habit of tracking the child's location with the same peripheral attentiveness with which he tracked the horizon. The news of the second pregnancy was met with a different quality of response than the first. The first had been struck stillness and finding no words. The second was warmth and certainty, and Phineas sweeping Emma off her feet in the kitchen, literally, her feet leaving the floor, and saying, "That is wonderful," with the full conviction of a man who meant it. "You don't know yet," Emma said, laughing. "Whether it's wonderful, whether it will." "Emma," he said, setting her down and holding her face in both hands in the way she knew so well now, the way she had associated with his absolute sincerity since that February morning. "It is wonderful." She had put her hands over his scarred, broad-palmed, cold-tested hands, the ones that had seen worse, and said, "Yes, it is." Their second child was a girl, born in April of 1883, with Emma's dark hair and Phineas's steady, observational quality of attention that manifested in infants as a kind of solemn watchfulness that the doctor called remarkably alert, and Mrs. Aldrich called the image of her father. They named her Frances Ruth for Ruth Holden, who had driven down from the crossing again when she'd heard, and who held Frances for the first 10 minutes of her life with an expression of utter besottedness that was extremely gratifying. Buffalo grew through those years in the way that frontier towns grow when they hit their productive phase: more buildings, more businesses, a telegraph office that went in 1882 and connected them to the larger world with a speed that still felt slightly unreal, a second school building that Emma helped design, and for which she lobbied the board with the focused persistence that had become her professional signature. The second school meant a second teacher, and Emma hired a young man named Ezra Cole, fresh from a normal school in Illinois, who was eager and good with the older students, and who deferred to Emma's experience in a way that she found both flattering and slightly concerning, until she established clearly that she wanted his genuine opinion and not his deference. Phineas's work at Clearwater had expanded over the years into genuine management of the northern operation, and he had built a professional reputation in the region that had led to him being consulted by other ranchers on grazing and cattle matters. He did this consulting with the same modest, concrete competence he brought to everything, and the income it produced had allowed them to expand the house: 2 more rooms, a proper parlor, a second bedroom for the children. But the thing that defined those years in Emma's memory was not the professional growth or the house expansion or the community building. What defined those years was the daily texture of a life built with someone she loved completely and was constantly discovering. Phineas was endlessly, surprisingly interesting to her. Not in a performance way, he did not perform for her, which was one of the things she valued most. But he continued to read, continued to think, continued to have opinions about the world that were formed through his own observation rather than inherited, and disagreed with her sometimes with the same direct respect with which she disagreed with him. And she had learned that an argument with Phineas about something they both cared about was one of the more stimulating intellectual experiences available to her in Buffalo, Wyoming. He brought the children into the natural world in the way he himself belonged to it, taking James with him on short rides from the time the boy could sit a horse, pointing out the things you learned from watching the sky and the land. James absorbed this with a seriousness that occasionally made him seem like a very small old person, and Emma watched it and thought about the ways children take what their parents offer and make something new with it. Frances was different. Frances was interested in everything with a sociable urgency that had her talking before her brother had, engaging every person who came near her with the focused curiosity of someone taking inventory of the world. She had Emma's gift with people, the ability to read a room and adjust herself to it. At 2 years old, she was already navigating adults with a skill that made Donald Haskell laugh and say she was going to run the county by the time she was 30. In the fall of 1884, on a Sunday afternoon in October, Emma and Phineas took the children on a ride into the hills east of Buffalo, a thing they did when the weather held, and there was a rare simultaneous day off from the various demands of their lives. James, at 3, rode in front of Phineas on his horse. Frances, at 18 months, was in a carrier that Emma had designed and constructed herself, strapped securely to her saddle in a way that left her free to see the world, and that Frances appeared to find entirely satisfactory. They rode out to a point where the land opened, and you could see south for what felt like forever, the wide Wyoming plain with the mountains behind it, the enormous sky, the particular quality of October light that made everything look slightly more real than usual. They stopped there and looked at it in the way that you look at things that are too large to take in all at once. Phineas had turned to look at Emma, and she had turned to look at him at the same moment, and they had been looking at each other in that open landscape with their children between them, and Emma had felt, she could not have described it more precisely than this, complete. Not finished, not static, not arrived at destination, end of story, but complete in the way that something is complete when all its essential parts are present and functioning and right. She thought about the train in Abilene and the hotel lobby in Laramie and the road heading north and the blizzard and the gloves pressed into her hands and the voice that had said with absolute certainty, "My hands have seen worse cold than this." She thought about how many times since then she had watched those hands working, resting, holding a book, holding James, holding her, and how the truth of that statement continued to expand in her understanding. Not just the cold, the difficulty, the loss. The years of solitary movement. Those hands had seen worse, and they had survived it, and they had come, eventually, to this. To a Sunday in October in the Wyoming hills with a 3-year-old on the horse in front of him and a woman beside him who knew him entirely and chose him daily. She said his name. He looked at her. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The smile that came across his face, the full, real, complete one, said that he understood and that he felt it too. They sat there for a long time, the 4 of them, in the October light before turning the horses home. The winter of 1884 was hard but manageable, and by spring the household was busy with the garden, and the school's year-end preparations and James's increasingly confident writing and Frances's discovery of language, as a system she found extremely useful for expressing her considerable opinions. Phineas had begun teaching James to identify the different grasses of the plains, a thing his old mentor on the trail had taught him, he said, and that had saved him more than once when pasture quality was uncertain. Emma had begun writing, in the evenings after the children were asleep, a series of curriculum guides for frontier schools, practical, grounded materials that drew on her 5 years of teaching in Buffalo, and that she believed could be useful to schools across the territory. It had started as personal notes and had grown into something she was beginning to think had real value beyond her own classroom. Martha Haskell had read an early draft and said, flatly, "You should publish this." Emma had looked at her. "I mean it," Martha said. "Send it to a publisher. There are educational publishers in the East. Your name on a proper book would mean something for schools across Wyoming." Emma had sat with this idea for several weeks, examining it from all angles the way she examined all significant things, and had concluded that Martha was right. She had written to 2 educational publishers in New York, enclosing sample chapters, and received in the spring of 1885 a letter from one of them expressing genuine interest. When she told Phineas, he had read the letter twice and then looked at her with an expression that was, she recognized, pure pride, not possessive pride, not reflected pride, but the genuine pleasure of a man watching someone he loved accomplish something real. "Of course they want it," he said. "It hasn't been confirmed yet. It will be." He said it with the same certainty he had said everything he was sure of, and Emma had learned to trust that certainty because it was not bravado, it was assessment. "You know more about teaching frontier children than anyone they'll have heard from." It was confirmed in August of 1885. The curriculum guide, she had titled it simply, Frontier Schoolroom, a practical guide for Western teachers, was to be published the following year by the educational press of a New York firm, with Emma Keating Holloway listed as author. The community of Buffalo treated this news with the combination of genuine pride and complete practicality that Emma had come to love about them. Several people congratulated her warmly. The school board mentioned it at their meeting as evidence of the school's quality, and Mrs. Aldrich, now in her late 60s and showing no signs of slowing, told her that she'd known from the first week that Emma Keating was not ordinary, and that she hoped Emma had not let any fool tell her otherwise. Emma assured her that no fool had successfully managed it. In the autumn of 1885, Emma and Phineas found themselves sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, the same table, the same lamp, the same warm stove, and Emma found herself thinking about the conversation that had happened at this table 5 years earlier, when she had told him about the first pregnancy. James, 4 years old now, was asleep in his room with his absolute conviction that he needed no such thing fully overridden by his body's needs. Frances, too, had gone down earlier and with more drama, as was her way. The house was quiet. Phineas was reading. Emma was reviewing school preparation. And she was thinking about what she wanted to say, which was not a school matter at all. "Phineas," she said. He looked up. "I want to ask you something." He closed the book. He always did that, gave her his full attention when she signaled she wanted it, every time. "Are you happy?" she said. "Here, this life. Are you?" He looked at her steadily. "Why are you asking?" "Because I am," she said. "And I want to know if you are too, not if things are fine, not if they're acceptable. I want to know if you are genuinely, actually happy." He was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, she knew, but finding the honest and precise answer. "I didn't know," he said, "for a long time whether I was the kind of person capable of this." He gestured at the house, the life, the whole arrangement. "Not whether I wanted it, I knew I wanted it, whether I could stay, whether the thing in me that kept moving was always going to be stronger than the thing that wanted to be still." Emma waited. "You stopped it," he said simply. Not in a way that felt like stopping, in a way that felt like arriving. He looked at her. "Yes, I am happy. Genuinely. Completely. More than I knew was possible." She reached across the table and he took her hand, the easy, familiar, essential gesture of 2 people who had built something together and knew its value. "Good," she said. He lifted her hand and kissed it with a tenderness that was no less real for being practiced and familiar by now. "You," he said. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Phineas, every day." The book was published in early 1886 and distributed to schools across Wyoming and Colorado, and eventually into other territories. And Emma began receiving letters from teachers, mostly women, mostly managing the same overcrowded, underfunded, logistically complex situations. She'd learned from telling her that the guide had helped them, that it addressed problems they'd been solving alone, that it made them feel less isolated in the particular challenge of frontier education. These letters moved her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She began writing back systematically, because it was the right thing to do, and because she had things to say that were still useful, and because she understood that what she had built in Buffalo could have implications beyond Buffalo. Phineas read the letters sometimes when she shared them. He read them with the same quality of attention he brought to everything she did, not passively, but engaged, responsive, saying things that helped her think about what she was doing and where it could go. "You should go further," he said one evening, "beyond the guide, a second volume or a different kind of resource." She looked at him. "You think so? I think you've been in correspondence with teachers across 3 territories for 6 months, and you have more material for Volume 2 than you probably realize." He was right. He usually was, about the things she was too close to see clearly. That was one of the specific values of being deeply known. Someone could see your work from outside while caring about it the way you cared about it from inside. Volume 2 was written over 1886 and sent to the publisher in early 1887, when Emma was pregnant again. James was 5. Francis was nearly 4. The household was organized in the particular efficient, slightly chaotic way of a house with 2 small children and 2 working parents who were managing everything, by dividing it sensibly and checking in with each other every evening. The 3rd child arrived in August of 1887, another son. They named him Samuel Frederick Holloway, Samuel for no particular reason, except that they both loved the name. Frederick for Phineas's older brother who was still in Missouri, and with whom Phineas had recently re-established contact, a correspondence that had started tentatively and was growing into something meaningful. Samuel was, from the start, the most tranquil of the 3, a baby of remarkable equanimity who seemed to have arrived having already made peace with the world, and who slept reliably and ate reliably, and regarded his older siblings' chaos with an expression of settled acceptance. James, 5 and the sober eldest, had taken to the role of older brother with a seriousness that was touching. Francis, unimpressed by the competition for attention that babies represented, had spent approximately 2 weeks adjusting, and then decided Samuel was acceptable, and began supervising his care with the authority of someone who had been doing this for years. Phineas with 3 children had the same quality he'd always had: steady, present, attentive, not performing fatherhood but actually doing it. And Emma watched it and felt that her life contained more richness than she could sometimes hold simultaneously. The house had expanded again, a proper 2nd floor now, with 3 bedrooms, the work done in the summer of 1887 by a local builder with Phineas working alongside him in the evenings, and on weekends with the determination of a man who had decided his family was going to have a proper house. Ruth Holden came to stay for a month that autumn, helping with the household in the early weeks after Samuel's birth, and had by this point become such a regular presence in their lives that the children treated her as a fixture. She had, since Emma had known her, grown from a sharp-eyed 20-year-old into a sharp-eyed 27-year-old, who was managing Holden's crossing almost entirely on her own since her father's health had begun to decline, and who had about her the quality of someone who had not yet found the thing they were most meant for. Emma and Ruth had long conversations in the evenings while Phineas sat with the children, and Emma had said once carefully, "You could do more than the relay station, Ruth. You have the intelligence and the capability, and—" "I know," Ruth said, with a directness that reminded Emma of herself. "I'm still figuring out what that means." "You have time." "I know that too." She looked at Emma with an expression that was part affection and part something more complex. "You found yours by accident on a train." "I found mine by necessity and chaos and a Wyoming blizzard," Emma corrected. "The accident was finding him in it." Ruth had smiled, and it was the smile of someone who was looking forward to her own accidental finding. The years moved forward with the particular quality of good years, not without difficulty, because difficulty was always present in frontier life and in human life generally, but with a fundamental soundness, a fundamental rightness, that held through the difficulties and was enriched by them. James started school in Emma's classroom, which was a situation requiring some delicacy, and which he navigated with the solemn seriousness that characterized him. He did not want special treatment, and Emma did not give it, and the arrangement worked because both of them were, at bottom, professionals in their respective roles. Francis, beginning school 2 years later, was a different proposition. Francis had opinions about the curriculum, delivered them with an absolute confidence that reminded her mother of someone, and required Emma to be her most diplomatic and redirecting self to channel that energy into learning rather than debate. Emma managed this. She had been managing Phineas's equally confident opinions for years, and this was preparation she hadn't known she'd been given. Donald Haskell retired from active management of Clearwater Ranch in 1890 and handed the operation formally to his son, Edward, with Phineas as the ranch's senior manager, a position that came with a genuine stake in the operation's success and a salary that reflected Phineas's actual contribution over 11 years. The night this arrangement was formalized, Phineas had come home and told Emma, and she had said, "That's not a surprise," and he had laughed and said, "It shouldn't be, but it is, a little," and she had known what he meant, that there was still in this man who had spent his 20s moving and not building, a faint astonishment that he had built something. She had pulled him close in the kitchen while the children's various sounds came from the rooms above them, and the stove ticked, and the Wyoming evening settled outside, and she had said, into the side of his neck, "You have always deserved this." He had held her tightly for a long moment without speaking. In the fall of 1891, Emma's curriculum guide series was, through the recommendation of a Wyoming territorial education official who had used the guides himself, formally adopted as recommended reading for teacher training across the territory. The letter informing her of this arrived on a Thursday morning, and Emma had read it at the kitchen table and sat very still for a minute and then gone to the school and taught a full day because that was what you did, and told Phineas that evening. His face had done the thing it did when he was moved past the point of easy expression, the stillness first, and then the full, complete warmth coming through it. "Emma," he said. "Don't," she said, because she could see she was going to cry and she didn't want to. "I'm going to say it anyway," he said. "You changed things, for teachers across the territory who are doing the hardest kind of work alone. You changed their work and they'll change children's lives, and you did that." She did cry briefly and without apology, and he held her while she did, and then she pulled back and said, "All right, I'm done," and he said with the particular smile, "I know," and she had laughed. The winter of 1891 was mild, and Christmas was a large gathering. Martha and Donald Haskell, Edward and his wife, Ruth Holden, who had moved to Buffalo the previous year after her father's death, taking up a position as the assistant to the town surveyor that suited her in ways she'd been working toward, several families from the school community. The house was too small for all of them, but they managed it with the cheerful inefficiency of people who wanted to be together more than they needed to be comfortable. Phineas and Donald sat in the corner after dinner, and Emma watched them from across the room, the older man and the one who had come to his ranch 12 years ago as a drifter looking for work, and who had become as essential to that place as the land itself. She watched them talk and thought about what Phineas had said on the train to himself, about heading toward something rather than away from it. He had found it. He was sitting in it, and he knew. She caught his eye from across the room, and he raised his glass slightly. in the small private acknowledgement they had developed, their own language, built over years, requiring nothing so large as a gesture and communicating everything. She raised hers back. The years closed around the late 1880s and turned into the early 1890s, with the texture of lives fully lived, James at 12 becoming a serious, deeply capable young person who split his time between Emma's school and the ranch with a natural ease between both worlds. Frances at 10 being the most socially skilled human being Emma had ever encountered at any age, already organizing her peers with a cheerful authority that suggested she would be running things formally by adulthood. Samuel at 6, a child of such even temperament and observational depth that his teacher, Emma's colleague, Ezra Cole, told Emma regularly that Samuel Holloway was the most interesting student he had ever taught, and Emma and Phineas at the center of it all, moving through their days with the particular quality of two people who have decided and continue deciding, every day, to be toward each other, not taking each other for granted, not falling into the grooves of habit that subtract awareness, still genuinely interested, still genuinely present, still reaching for each other in the evening the way you reach for something necessary. On a November evening in 1892, 13 years after a blizzard had brought them to the edge of the same storm-gray wilderness, and he had given her his gloves and said what he had said, they sat on the porch of their house in the cold, wrapped in coats, watching the sky. The children were inside. The house behind them was full of light and the sounds of the evening meal's aftermath, James doing something with arithmetic at the table, Frances presumably organizing something or someone, Samuel quiet as he always was. The sky to the north had that heavy, familiar look. "Storm coming," Emma said. "Yes." Phineas was watching it with the horizon attention she had first noticed in the passenger car of a train in Abilene, Kansas, 14 years ago. "Are the horses settled?" she asked. "I settled them before dinner." He looked at her sideways. "You know I settled them." "I know," she said. "I just like hearing it." He smiled. She looked at his hands resting on the porch rail in front of him. Those hands. She knew every scar and every callus and every particular quality of their touch, and they were still, after all this time, one of the most honest things she'd ever encountered. Hands that had seen hard things and survived them, and then, unexpectedly, not by plan, by the grace of a chain of circumstances that included a con man in Laramie and a relay station, and a blizzard had arrived at this. At her. She reached out and covered one of his hands with hers. His fingers curled up between hers immediately, the automatic, unconscious rightness of it. "My hands have seen worse cold than this," she said quietly, with the particular intimacy of a private language, of words that meant their own history. He turned to look at her, and there it was, the full smile, the complete one, the one she had been seeing for 13 years, and that still did the thing it did to her chest. "They have," he agreed. He brought her hand up and kissed her knuckles with the tenderness that was built now from thousands of such moments, each one adding to the weight of the whole, the warmth of the whole. "And so have yours." She looked at him in the cold November evening, in the light from the house behind them and the low, heavy sky ahead of them, with the sounds of their children and their life surrounding them. "I'm glad," she said, "that I was on that train." "So am I," he said, "every day." They sat together on the porch as the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and certain, over the town of Buffalo and the hills to the east, and the wide Wyoming plain that stretched south toward where a woman had once packed 2 trunks and sold a farm, and boarded a train into uncertainty with $12 and a teaching certificate, and a pride that would not bend. The snow came down around them, and they sat in the warmth of each other's presence, and inside the house their children moved through the evening, and the life they had built together held firm around them on all sides. Phineas's hands were warm. They had been warm for years.